Hey, good morning. It's August the 3rd, fine, beautiful day outside. You're going to be starting your classes in about 2.5 to 3 weeks. Last time we were together, we talked about a number of things that we always talk about, a number of things here. We completed the colonization of the last, whatever it was, 7 colonies. That brought us up to 13 colonies. And from that point, we went on into making a comparison of the Chesapeake with that of New England. You saw the life expectancy of one of those areas was much greater than it was any other area. In fact, it was almost double that. All right, today we're going to be working on another section here as we approach the French and Indian War. And we'll actually go through the French and Indian War very shortly here. But let's go through a few preliminary things first. And we're in Chapter 4 now, and if you'll take your attention over to page 98, and let me flip over to your textbook here. And I actually love this. This is so appropriate for this time. If you look carefully here, folks, this is in New York City. And notice some of your fellow American citizens right here who are toppling a statue. They're pulling down a statue. See, we Americans come about it in the right way. We've been toppling statues here for about 200 years. Maybe that was an unkind thing to say, but nevertheless, that's what we're doing here. Now, as late as the 1750s, many Americans were pleased with being a part of the British Empire. We had trade, commerce, military protection, political stability was also provided by that. But by 1750, many of these colonial legislators began to levy taxes upon the people, and this, of course, came without the approval of the people itself here. Now, one individual I'd like to address here is Benjamin Franklin. Let me get my documents down here. Benjamin Franklin was from Pennsylvania. He served as a lobbyist, and in fact he lobbied for Pennsylvania, Georgia, New Jersey, Massachusetts. And we'll continue with Benjamin Franklin just a few seconds. But let's take a look at the population in the major cities in our country at that time. Of course, we're just talking about the 13 colonies, and the largest 2 cities was out of Philadelphia and New York. They rivaled each other with approximately 32,000 for their population. The population in New York may have been about 30,000, so it was slightly less than Philadelphia, or some historians will say it was the same. We look at Boston. Boston had a population of 15,000. That's about the size of Jasper, Alabama. Charleston, population, Charlestown, South Carolina, population 12,000. You don't need to know any of this. And if we look at Newport, Rhode Island, it's hard to believe this because I don't think Newport has a population of 11,000 today. I was there a couple of summers ago. Not a very large place whatsoever. A lot of colonial history which is present there. Now, in 1754, Benjamin Franklin made a proposal to create an intercolonial federation for the mutual defense against the Indians. Each colony would have a representative. There would be a governor general that would preside over this. In other words, this was an attempt to form a government at that time, anyway. And would you believe me, when these individuals met at Albany, New York, it's known as the Albany Congress, the Albany Plan, not a single colony of these 13 colonies bought into the idea of forming a colonial federation and trying to unify. So we've got a long way to go before we establish the United States. And we're going to do that. Not today. It's going to take quite a while before we do this. Several lectures in front of us. All right, so let's get back to the documents, camera here. And anyway, so when I ask you in the future about the Albany Plan, how many colonies bought into that concept, I hope that you will tell me 0. All right, so we don't speak very often of sprints, and perhaps we do need to do so more often. Well, let's take a few seconds here and let's talk about friends. And an individual I'd like to make you acquainted with, and I'm not going to hold you responsible for him. You take my Western Civilization class, and everything you ever wanted to know I'll tell you about with Louis XIV. Louis XIV, that's the way it is pronounced here. He's a sun king, worshiper of Apollo. If you ever get a chance to go to Paris, wonderful place to visit is the Chateau de Versailles, the palace at Versailles. And this was a home, if you will, of Louis XIV, Louis XV, Louis XVI, and various others too. But it's probably there's no probably about it, it is the most glamorous palace that you ever cast your eyes on. And Louis XIV wanted to have world expansion for France. World domination, world expansion. And several of these French explorers that were involved in this, these individuals, you want to pronounce the name as Louis Jolliet, and father is Jacques Marquette. Louis Gillet, Father Jacques Marquette. And this was in 1763, and they navigated the Mississippi River. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. I've added a new little device behind me here, folks. So give me a chance to get this worked out. And if we look at our map here, in 1763, where these two explorers left from was Fort LeBay, and this is Fort LeBay here. Think in your mind here, Green Bay, Wisconsin. And by canoe, they went down the Fox River here, all the way to the Mississippi River, and down the Mississippi River, laying claim for France for all of this territory, and made their way all the way to the Arkansas River. And this is the Arkansas River, where I've lost it right here. But this is the Arkansas River, which is right here. Laying claim to all of that for France. All right, now, I'm going to make a quick switch, and I'll introduce you to another French explorer here, and had an expedition of about 48 Frenchmen, French Canadians, and this individual's name was Sieur de la Salle. Now, it's Sir, like Sir La Salle. Sieur de la Salle. This is in 1682, made an exploration with these 48 men or so down the Mississippi River. And let me flip back to my map here. All right, see if you can track on this. And went down the Mississippi River and even beyond the Arkansas River and laid claim to all of this area here for France. And in fact, what they ended up naming this area, they named it Louisiana. Wonder who it's named for. And I bet you can suspect it's named for Louis XIV. And in 1718, the city here of New Orleans was established here. New Orleans, which was a French-controlled city. Now, those French people of French descent, the white people of French descent that settled in this area were called Creoles. All right, so let me go back to my documents camera here, and let's continue on with this. France. During the meantime, France established a number of forts, a number of cities here, cities which were located in Quebec. I'll show you some photographs of Quebec, a most beautiful, beautiful city, one of my very favorite cities. Montreal, not one of my favorite cities, but nevertheless it's a large city. But all these cities were established here. Fort Detroit, it was the original French fort, and in one of the coldest places annually in Canada today, there's a place called Sault Ste. Marie, right there on the border between the United States and Canada. One of these forts that was established was Fort Louisbourg, which is on the Cape Breton Peninsula. I don't know if you can see this very clearly, but that's what it looks like today, and that's on one of my to-do lists. I have not been to Fort Louisbourg. I would like to do it, and we'll bring that up again very shortly here. All right, so let's move on with this. Now, for the colonists were engaged in several wars, allying with English here. And I have to tell you here that we're going to see it for about 80 years. It's going to be almost constant conflict between the English and the French. Now, one of these wars that took place, and it didn't really involve the colonists too very much, was a war which was called King William's War. If you take my Western Civilization class, we call it the 9 Years' War. It lasted, according to U.S. history, 1689, 1697. The William that you're looking at there is like William and Mary. There was a second war that took place, and American colonists were engaged in this, particularly fighting with the French in the north and Spanish in the south, called King Anne's War. It lasted from 1701 1713. And if you take my Western Civilization course, we call it the War of Spanish Succession here. And it ended with the Treaty of Utrecht. So the American provincials were involved in this. More so, the American provincials were involved allying with the British. And you got to remember that all these, I called them American provincials, but they're all English there. But the other war was King George's War. Now, this is George II, lasted from 1744 to 1748. Taking my Western Civilization course, we call it the War of Austrian Succession here. It did involve the American colonists, and once again, I'll throw this on the screen here. The American colonists were given the responsibility of taking this fort, this French fort on Cape Breton Peninsula, which is called Fort Louisbourg. And the Americans were successful with this. If you want to read a good section in history, delve into this subject a little bit further. A lot of trials and tribulations that these young Americans endured in overtaking that fort. All right, so anyway, that was that here. So let's move on here. And I want to go back to my map here that is behind me, and let me get this over here. And let's go back to this map. And what I want you to look at here, folks, let's take a look at this section here. And what is in pink here, these are British. These are British colonies here, British controlled areas. You can't see it on the map here, so let me try to lower it. If we go down to where Florida is, where Alabama, parts of Georgia would be present there. The yellow represents Spanish-controlled territory. And if we raise it a little bit, everything else here that is in this color of orange, that is all French. That is all French, and that's just absolutely amazing here. I don't understand today why you and why we're not speaking French as our native tongue today instead of English here. Because by all rights, when we look at this map, French should have taken over all of these areas here. All right. Now, where we're going to have the problem to take place here in 1753 and 1754 is going to be up in this area here. Because if you see the proximity, we have French-controlled areas here, British-controlled areas here, in the Ohio Valley here. And both the French and both the British were both claiming this area as their own. So in 1754, a young man, he was 21 years of age in 1754, led an expedition of 159 men. And they left out of this area right along through here, and they went overland. And what their goal was to come up to a French fort here, which is called Fort Duquesne. Now today, if you're visiting in that area, that's where Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is located. And they were going up here. And what they were going to try to do was to negotiate with the French to get off of this area that is claimed by both Great Britain and France. And as George, and I gave the name away to, I was going to tell you that this was a person that was a semi-aristocrat. He was a surveyor. He was not at the top level in the hierarchy in Virginia, but he was right below that. He would later marry into the hierarchy itself. But that individual's name is none other than George Washington. 21-year-old George Washington. He was a major, or perhaps he was a lieutenant colonel. The ranks differ according to the historian that you're talking with. All right, here's how you spell that French fort, and this is the French fort, and it is spelled Fort Duquesne. All right, it is pronounced Fort Duquesne. It looks like it would be pronounced Duquesne or something, but it's Fort Duquesne. It's where Pittsburgh is located today. All right, and then George Washington, he was approaching with his 159 men. And as he got closer, he had some Indian allies with him under Tenochtisan, half-king. And as they got close, they ran across a French group of soldiers. And they ended up ambushing these French soldiers. And unfortunately for George Washington and his 159 militiamen, inexperienced militiamen, these some of the French actually were able to escape. And when they did so, they went to Fort Duquesne and told the soldiers in Fort Duquesne and the commanders there what had happened to them, that there had been a massacre. And so the French sent out an expeditionary force, and it was a large expeditionary force against George Washington's 159 men. And when Washington got word that they were approaching, George Washington assembled a hastily built fort. And this fort, hang on a second here, and this fort was given the name Fort Necessity. Now, when you look through your included videos, you'll see a video there that deals with that, with Fort Necessity, and I hope you'll spend some time with that. Well, it was a poorly chosen site, and when the French came in, the French Canadians with their Indian allies, they found that the Fort Necessity was in a lower ground. So all the French had to do was just to take a higher ground, fire over the fortress walls into Fort Necessity, and it killed a number of George Washington's men. And that's when George Washington made the decision there's no way out. And so he ordered that the kegs of rum be broken into, and that just drink the rum, because I'm going to declare a surrender here. And sure enough, George Washington, the father of our country, did surrender to the French. Now, George Washington did not speak a word of French. He couldn't read French. He couldn't speak French, to my knowledge anyway. And when the surrender document was presented to him, George Washington signed that surrender document, to the French. Included in that French document was a French dignitary that had been actually murdered during that first battle where George Washington and his Indian and his men ambushed that French force. And so anyway, Washington signed that document, hence he actually declared himself guilty of assassinating French diplomat. The reason he signed that is that he actually could not read French. All right, so shall we continue on with this too? So that was George Washington. Now, that's technically the beginning of the French and Indian War. I did not write that down for you, and you'll want to write that down, the French and Indian War. Now, a lot of people are mistaken with this, and they think the French and Indian War is the French against the Indians. And it is not that way at all. It's the French and Indians fighting together against the British. And let me say that one more time to you folks here. Many people think that the French and Indian War was the French fighting the Indians, and it is not that way at all. It's the French and the Indians fighting together and fighting against the British. Everybody got that? You need to recognize that. All right, so let's go back to my documents camera here. And one of the first engagements that took place here, an engagement which was led by the British, and the British were led by this General Edward Braddock. Some people gave him a nickname. They called him the Bulldog. He had in his force here, he had about 1,200 men in his force. And let's see, do I have those numbers for you? And anyway, I think I have it down here in a little bit for you. Now, let me switch back to the camera here, show you where it took place here. And it was up in this area here, which is near Fort Duquesne. It's not very far from where George Washington had his hastily built Fort Necessity. And General Braddock came up, and he had his 1,400 or 1,200 redcoats with him. George Washington was right there. I was going to say that George Washington was right there by his side, but he actually was not. George Washington was experiencing hemorrhoids at that time, so he was flat on his back in a buckboard wagon. All right, but anyway, as they approached, the British approached, they were being very, very cautious. And as they would come up to the rivers, they would stop on the edge of the river and then send a reconnaissance group to the opposite side of the river to check to see if there was French Indians or French Canadians present there. And if no one was present, then the main body of soldiers would actually advance across. And they kept doing that and being very cautious until they got up to the area which was called the Monongahela River. And I've tried to illustrate this for you here. And let's just say, for example, here, we have the British. Let me use the pointer here. And the British are moving north. They're coming in this direction here. This is the Monongahela River that's present here in the blue. And as the British came up, they sent the scouts over to the other side here. And what it looked like was that there were no French and Indians and French Canadians present there. But actually what had happened here, that reconnaissance group went into an ambush. And this represents here, this represents the French and the Indians and the French Canadians, which were present there. All right, I think I've got the numbers for this on my next sheet here. And so when the reconnaissance element went over, the French and Canadians and the Indians began to fire on the reconnaissance group, and this caused this group, the main body of soldiers, to rush across the shallow river right here. And what this creates is this huge red fireball, or huge red target right here. And I will tell you good folks something, they were cut to pieces here. From Braddock's army, which started with 1,400 soldiers, 977 killed. For General Braddock had 4 horses shot out from under him before he was finally mortally wounded himself. George Washington, by this time, was riding horseback right next to Braddock and actually grabbed the horse reins off of Braddock to prevent the horse from bucking him off with that. The losses for this, for the French, 72 losses, 146 French Canadians. And, this is the Indian force and French and Canadian force. I had 72 French, 637 Indians, 146 Canadians, and it resulted in killed 39. 39 of the French, the Canadians, and Indians were killed, to a loss of 977 British soldiers there. It was just a slaughter here. This is referred to as Braddock's defeat. Braddock's defeat. You can visit that area today. The British were panicked in such a way that they abandoned those 977 on the battlefield, and it would not be until 3 years later into which those skeletonized remains would be recovered by the British here. It was just an atrocity that took place. All right, so thus begins the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. All right, it's going to all start Fort Necessity, continues with Braddock's defeat. Okay, so let's move through this, and I'm going to show you a couple of words here very quickly here, and I'm going to switch to a map. You can use your textbook map if you wish to do so, and it's okay, but it's not the best in the world here. All right, but let's try to use this. This came out of another textbook here. And during the first parts of the war, 1755, 1756, the French were very, very successful. One of the greatest of the French generals was General Montcalm. Let's see here. I'm working upside down, so I have to explore where this is. And there's his name right here, General Montcalm. But for the French were able to take the British fort here at, let me find it here, at Fort Niagara. Here's Fort Niagara here. I'm sorry, I'm working upside down, so it's kind of difficult to do this. And Fort Niagara. Let's see if I may have a photograph here of Fort Niagara. Not very far from where Niagara Falls is today, but that's what it looks like. All right, we'll move right along with this. And for the French were able to take Crown Point. I don't know if that's on the map here. Crown Point, which is right in this area here, and this is what Crown Point looks like today. It is in ruins. I think it has a British flag on it today, but and it had a British flag on it then, but the French were able to take that fort, and the French were able to continue further. Let's see if I find it on my map here, and I do not see it here, but it's located right in this area here, which is called Fort William Henry. Here's an article here about the siege and massacre at Fort William Henry. You can visit there today if you wish to do so. There is a charge for this reconstructed fort. I've been by it, but I was too cheap to actually pay for the ticket there to go inside. And let's see what else we have here. And the French were successful in taking this fort, which is called Fort Ticonderoga. You can see it here high above the grounds here, or high above the St. Lawrence River. High above the Hudson River. Present there. You can visit there today. Last time I was up there was a couple of years ago. They were charging $25 per person for a ticket to go in Fort Ticonderoga. And I did not go in there. I've been there before when there was no charge for it. But and it's kind of an interesting fort. You'll hear me talk about Fort Ticonderoga on several more occasions, one more time during this class period, and then we'll have another occasion when we get into the American Revolution. So at this point in class, I would ask you, good folks, how are the British doing? And the British are doing very, very poorly. How are the French doing? The French are doing very, very well. Well, fortunately for the British, they were able to get things turned around a little bit. Let's see if I can find a name down here. Here's the name of those forts, by the way: Fort Ticonderoga, Crown Point, Fort William Henry, Fort Niagara. And then finally, in 1757, the British appointed a new war minister, and it came in the form of a person by the name of William Pitt. William Pitt. Now, don't get it confused with William Penn, because it's not William Penn, one of the founders of Pennsylvania. This is William Pitt here. Got a lot to talk about with William Pitt in the next few lectures to come anyway. But nevertheless, here for William Pitt, he brought about some changes in the war. It's going to greatly increase the British funding for the war, and things began to change. One of the things that he did, he stopped his practice of impressment. And under impressment, that's where these British soldiers would go through a colonial community and they'd just look around, and if they needed soldiers for their army, they would just draft on the spot these Americans. And it was not a popular thing here. And William Pitt stopped that practice. He also stopped the practice, and this was used by the British, when they would go through American British cities. They would seize goods, and seizing of goods is what I meant right there, without the payment here. They would just go into the stores, take whatever they needed, and just walk away from that. It was very aggravating to these American colonists here. A lot of complaints here, and William Pitt put a stop to that. One of the things that he did not stop is a quartering of troops in private homes. And that was an annoyance. And we're going to continue to see this be an annoyance to the Americans, just in general, all the way up until the American Revolution, which is not too far in the future, by the way, here. But the way in which these colonial cities would get around this, they would build barracks. And if you build a barracks, like a barn, a barracks, and furnish those for the British soldiers, then you wouldn't have the problem of having the British soldiers trying to stay in your own home with that, too. So things began to turn around a little bit. Let's see if I wrote a couple of names down here, and I didn't. Well, I think I have them down a little bit further. But let's go back to our map here, and let's see how the British are going to turn things around here. And for the British, they will be able to successfully retake Fort Niagara, which is here. The British will take Fort Oswego, which was a French fort. The British will take Fort Frontenac, which is present here. The British will be successful in retaking Fort Ticonderoga. And they actually will move through the countryside here. Let me see where we are here. And we'll take Fort Duquesne. Where is Fort Duquesne on the map up here? That's Fort Oswego. Here it is. I'm way off with that. And they would take Fort Duquesne, present here. George Washington was a part of this foray here. Fort Duquesne, the French fort, fell to the British, along with George Washington, not led by George Washington, however, led by John Forbes, and fell without a shot, if you will. All right, so things are turning around for the British. Okay, let's move over here to this side, and for the British will come over here and take this area, Beaujeu, take this area. Now, watch what's going to take place here, because this is absolutely magnificent here. This is under the command of a British general by the name of James Wolfe. And what the British will do, they will take their army, place them on ships, and they will go in this direction here. And where we have our old friend up here, Fort Louisbourg, they will take this French fort, Fort Louisbourg, and they will continue around here in this fashion, by ship, by boat, and enter into the St. Lawrence and move up the St. Lawrence until they get to the city of Quebec. All right, so they were present here in Quebec. Now, present in Quebec was a French army, and this French army was under the French general Montcalm. So you had Wolfe on the British, you had Montcalm here, who was on the French. Now, by all rights, Montcalm, with the French, should have stayed within the fortified walls of Quebec. But he did not do so, and I don't understand why he did not. And actually what took place is that Montcalm left the security of the fort and went out onto the battlefield here, which was given the name the Plains of Abraham. It was named for a farmer there by the name of Abraham, and it took place in his pastures. So the Plains of Abraham. And that's where the actual battle took place here. So let me share some photographs with you, and these are great photos here. I want to show you first of all what this beautiful city of Quebec actually looks like. You will find no prettier place in Canada or in North America here. And this famous fort, it's not a fort, but it's a famous hotel which is called the Chateau Frontenac. The Chateau Frontenac. And you'd be surprised that staying there for overnight will cost you about $130. It really is inexpensive with that. Very, very, very friendly here. Now down here, this is where the St. Lawrence River is located. And when the British came in, the British were coming in on this side here and on their ships, and they just literally went by the fort. And when they got to the other side of the fort, or the other side of Quebec, maybe a half mile or so, that's when they went up the hill, and that's where they would be engaged on the Plains of Abraham. Here's another photograph of Quebec showing you the Chateau Frontenac, and also some gun emplacements there. Beautiful, beautiful city. It makes me homesick right now, wishing I was back there. All right, I want to show you a photograph of where the Plains of Abraham, what they look like. And like I said, it was a farmer's pasture, farmer's field, which was just called, whose name was Abraham, and they just called it the Plains of Abraham. Where the British were coming from, let's see if I can get this right, where the British were coming from was this direction, coming across here, and the French were up on this side, defending here. All right, close combat took place here, and ironically, both the French commander and the British commander both lost their lives here. All right, this took place on September 13th in 1759, the Battle of Quebec. The French commander, Montcalm, was killed, mortally wounded, and died, and the British commander here, James Wolfe, likewise. So both commanding officers lost their lives. When you go to the Plains of Abraham today, here's a statue that marks the place in which the British general James Wolfe lost his life here. And you'll see, if you look at paintings from this battle here on the Plains of Abraham, you'll see the British general James Wolfe being tended to before he actually died. All right, now the war will continue for one more year, but it's pretty much over by now. Continues for one more year. And finally, we have this battle, which if you want to call it a battle, that took place here in 1760, which is the Battle of Montreal. The British general that was victorious in that battle was also victorious in retaking Fort Ticonderoga, that I showed you a little bit earlier, was the British general Geoffrey Amherst. Very, very effective British general, as much so as that of James Wolfe. So let's bring this war to a close here, folks. And we're going to bring it to a close in 1763 with what is called the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris will end this war. So, what is the outcome to the Treaty of Paris here? Well, I will tell you right now that France is the big loser in this. All right, so let's go back here. I want to use my map again, and I want to shift over a little bit. Let's see if I can get this shifted in the proper direction right here. And I want you, before we get it completely out of sight, go back and refresh your memory. Before the war started, before the French and Indian War started, this is what the British possessed. This is what the French possessed right here, a great chunk of North America. And we had to the south here, this is what the Spanish had. All right, so let's take a look at it now. And this is after the Treaty of Paris. This is after the Treaty of Paris here. And this is what it looks like now. What you're seeing here in the pink here, if you want to call that pink, those are all British possessions. So the British Empire in this part of the world actually doubles. It's going to double in size because this is where it was before, and now to the Mississippi River and Canada, all of that is British here. All right, now notice here also that the Spanish possessions here went to Great Britain. So temporarily we'll find that Florida becomes a British possession. And also as a part of this, since the Spanish had allied with the French felt obligation to award Spain all of this area right here, all of that area here. And another thing is that most of the French possessions that were present down in India and present in the Caribbean, they all went to Great Britain. So the plantations or the areas that the French controlled in India now become British possessions here. So if you look at this, if you look at all of this, who was a big gainer? Certainly Great Britain. Certainly that of Spain. But who's a big loser here in this French and Indian War? And it's obvious that it is France. All right, I want to share a couple of things, and pardon me for jumping in front of you like that. But I want to share with you an article. I'm going to go back to my documents camera here, and I show this to my class. And it's an article, I have it on display during the class here, and it talks about it addresses the topic, the Battle of Quebec, the day France lost North America. And you can see the name here, James Wolfe here. Let's see if there was anything else here. I thought it might have a likeness here, showing you James Wolfe in here. Yeah, here it is right here. It's a well-known painting. You see this very often, and talking about the Battle of Quebec here, showing you there James Wolfe as he's dying there on the Plains of Abraham. All right, everybody okay? All right, that's a lecture for the day here, my friends here. A fun lecture is the French and Indian War here. Repeat myself, France was a big loser, certainly Great Britain, and to some degree, Spain was too. Thank you very much for your attendance. Stay up with your work here, folks. It's going to start mounting up on you. I can already see your first examination on the horizon. Thank you.